They called their demonstration a war chest march. Their goal to protest Dallas companies with government contracts or who had helped finance the Republican convention.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Their antisocial behavior drew crowds of onlookers, among them this well-known Republican statesman, Barry Goldwater. At each stop, the routine was repeated. Slogans and signs were spray-painted on walks and walls. They chanted obscenities. Part of the group entered the famous Neiman Marcus store to protest. At City Hall, they burned an American flag. Finally, Dallas police surrounded the demonstrators and began making arrests.
Why the decision to arrest these folks now?
Well, the decision to arrest was made when they started tearing up the property. We probably would have tolerated the parade until they started spray painting things and trashing up buildings. At that point, it really wasn't much of a decision. It had to be done.
And so, one by one, the demonstrators were arrested. But it is doubtful they'll remain in jail long. ACLU members are already taking steps to post their bonds. Tom Steyer, News 4, Dallas.
Now, no one knew at the time of that news report that that day and that incident, and they just quickly mentioned the whole idea of an American flag being burned, no one knew that that was going to lead to a monumental Supreme Court decision in a case that eventually became known as Texas v. Johnson. Before we get to that, though, the whole idea of burning a flag, what form of expression would you use to describe the act of burning an American flag? And if you think about our discussion of free expression and free speech, you would know that it is symbolic speech. Okay, the idea of nonverbal communication, and you see some examples pictured here, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but things like bumper stickers and banners and clothing and candlelight vigils and picket signs and gestures and logos and symbols and things like that are all symbolic speech. Okay, so what happened was Johnson was protesting outside the Republican National Convention in Dallas, Texas. This is 1984, in the middle of the Reagan administration, and he burnt the American flag. And so he is arrested and eventually convicted of a Texas law in which it is illegal to desecrate a venerated object, such as the American flag. He was sentenced to a year in prison and fined $2,000. And so he appeals the case. Okay, and it goes up through the court system, and the state Supreme Court of Texas found that it was protected, as Johnson and his attorney, pictured here, claimed, as symbolic speech. And it was protected speech, and the Texas State Supreme Court agreed with him. And so the state of Texas then appealed it to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the question became, how do you think the U.S. Supreme Court will decide this case, in Johnson's favor or in favor of the state of Texas? And really, we kind of based this on what case do you believe is on point? What case that we discussed would be a citation that Johnson would have used? And the obvious one is Tinker versus Des Moines. If we're talking about symbolic speech, certainly Tinker versus Des Moines is applicable, and there is a political message there. And regardless, as the precedent in Tinker says, regardless of whether or not the government agrees with the message, they cannot restrict it nor punish it. And so the U.S. Supreme Court agreed, using Tinker as a case precedent to follow, and the speech was protected, and the case against Johnson was overturned. And the law in Texas and in any other state that had a law against burning the American flag, those laws were now unconstitutional, as it is seen as protected symbolic speech.